Somewhere along the way, we have missed what is radical about our faith, and we have replaced it with what is comfortable. We are settling for a Christianity that revolves around catering to ourselves, when the central message of Christianity is actually about abandoning ourselves. These convicting words about the state of today's American Christians have been going over and over in my head ever since this summer when I read David Platt's book called Radical. These words from David Platt indicate that this contemporary society has settled for the comfortable life, a life that is all about ourselves and our own agendas we have for the day. We are called to a life of radical discipleship, but are we really living as Jesus' disciples? In Mark chapter 8, where our passage is found today, Jesus is calling Christians to discipleship. In Mark 8:34, he says, "Then he called the crowd to him along with his disciples and said, 'If anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me.'" In the beginning of Mark's gospel, Jesus is conducting ministry in Galilee, which is a Roman province in Judea. In Mark chapter 1, Jesus begins by calling people to become his disciples. He calls people knowing that his life here on earth will soon come to an end. All throughout Jesus' ministry, he saw the risk of Christians becoming comfortable in their faith. And time again, he communicates this life of radical discipleship that we're called to have as Christians. It is essential for Jesus to pass his ministry on to his disciples so that they can continue the ministry that he led here on earth, and that lives can be impacted and transformed, and that we can pass our faith on to future generations. As Jesus predicted his death at the beginning of chapter 8, he continues to speak to the crowd that was gathered around him. This crowd was primarily made up of Jews and Gentiles that were all gathered in the region of the Decapolis. The Decapolis is located in modern-day Jordan and was a group of 10 cities in the eastern part of the Roman Empire, near Judea and Syria. These cities were grouped together because of their language, culture, location, and political status. It is here where Jesus sets the stage to speak to the crowd that is gathered around him. As Christians, we are called to a life of discipleship by taking 3 radical turns that are commanded of us in Mark 8:34. We are first commanded to take a radical turn toward a life of selflessness. Jesus begins his message by saying that in order to follow Christ, he must deny himself. This involves ceasing to make ourselves the object of our actions and the focus of our day. This is an important message that Jesus reiterates 2 other times in the verses immediately following, both in Mark 8:35 and Mark 8:38, where Jesus says, if we lose our life for Christ, we will find it, and we can't be concerned about pleasing ourselves. How often do we go about our lives living through the lens of our own agenda? How often do we go about our routines and focus on our priorities that we have for the day, thinking about what will bring us the most fulfillment and pleasure? Is that what our lives are about? Catering to ourselves and what will make us happy and content in life. By denying ourselves, we need to remove ourselves from the subject of our sentence. We are nothing without Christ, but as Christians, we have life in Christ, and we have a choice of how we're going to live our lives. We can't live a life of discipleship if we care too much about ourselves. By denying ourselves and our own agenda, we're giving Christ something to work with, and that is a heart of complete surrender and a willingness to walk in obedience to him. Second, we are commanded to take a radical turn toward a life of surrender. Jesus goes on to say in Mark 8:34 that if anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross. After we have chosen to abandon ourselves to Christ and live selflessly in the ministry that the Lord has prepared for us, we need to move toward this attitude of wanting to have control to a life of complete surrender. Jesus knew that he was leading his disciples into some uncomfortable situations, and some situations where he knew that they would be challenged to stand up for their faith, for Christ, for the gospel, and for truth. Cross-bearing indicates a willingness that we have to have a willingness to die for our faith. As Jesus' radical disciples, there will be many blessings in ministry, but along with the blessings, there will be times of great hardship, and we'll have to endure those times of great persecution that will involve a lot of pain and suffering as well. Lastly, we are commanded to take a radical turn toward a life of obedience. Jesus says, "Follow me." We need to be ready to go against the patterns of this world and follow the example of Christ. As future pastors, youth workers, are we prepared to selflessly go into this world and awaken this generation to this call of radical discipleship? Mark places a greater emphasis on Jesus' heart to serve in ministry and our call to discipleship more than any other gospel. This may be because of Mark's own past experiences with how he struggled himself with having to live a life of discipleship and how he was realizing the cost of having to give up everything to follow Christ. In Acts 12 and 13, we read how Mark accompanied Paul and Barnabas on the first part of their first missionary journey only to turn around shortly after they left and return to Jerusalem. Many explanations were given to why Mark chose to return to Jerusalem, but one of those explanations was due to his homesickness. Mark had trouble following Christ. He was too self-consumed in the comfortable life he knew back in Jerusalem that he had trouble being a radical disciple for Jesus Christ. Mark's relationship with Paul was temporarily damaged due to Paul's disappointment with Mark for leaving the mission early, but this was later redeemed as Mark proved to Paul his true partnership in ministry. Ever since Jesus called me into a life of ministry back in my senior year of high school, he has been continuing to refine this idea of what true discipleship actually means. And I've had to make some major radical turns in my own life to be a true disciple, a radical disciple of Jesus Christ. Made some changes so that my life doesn't revolve all around myself and what I want to do with my day. That was the mentality I had back in high school. Right now I'm working on surrendering my life completely and not thinking about trusting in the Lord and his plans for me after college and after I graduate, not knowing what that's going to look like at this point. And I'm also learning to walk in obedience to Christ, as he is going to probably take me into some uncomfortable situations and places that will involve me to go outside of my comfort zone. Radical discipleship is a journey with Christ and something that we will be learning our whole lives. And it is something that we learn in different ways as well, based on our willingness to make these radical changes. So are you willing to make these radical turns? I invite you, as partners in ministry, I invite you into this journey with me, this call of discipleship, as we together strive to make a conscious and wholehearted commitment to serve our God no matter what. And as we go into this world and into our own unique ministry journeys, and as we live as radical disciples. Would you pray with me? Dear Heavenly Father, God, I thank